Welcome to In Search of Heaven's Gate, an exploration of the history, beliefs, and practices of the Heaven's Gate movement. This is Episode 5, The Three-Voice Concept. Today, we're going to look at one of the ways in which the followers of Heaven's Gate sought to recondition their emotional and behavioral responses to make their actions and feelings conform more closely to the conduct of a so-called next-level member. The technique that I'll be talking about today is what they called the three-voice concept. In this episode, I'll be drawing once again on a short chapter called The Three Eyes, Who's Talking, which appears early on in a book called The Transfiguration Diet. I introduced this book in the last episode. Recall that the Transfiguration Diet was published by the followers of Heaven's Gate in 1986, and although most of the book is devoted to their dietary regimens, the chapter that we've been looking at focuses more on the group's conception of the mind or soul. Again, the mind or the soul is what the followers of Heaven's Gate believe will continue to exist after a person's body has died. Like many other religions, the Heaven's Gate belief system offers an account of what happens after death. But as we've seen, their beliefs about the afterlife are not always very easy to make sense of. In particular, their notion of some everlasting mind or soul that passes from life to life seems to contradict other statements they have made about the next level, which is the term they use to talk about the kingdom of heaven. They've claimed that the next level, or kingdom of heaven, is a literal place somewhere in the physical universe. The afterlife, as they understand it, is a physical location, not an ethereal one. But if that's the case, then where exactly does their particular understanding of the mind or the soul fit in with their understanding of the afterlife? Typically, when we think of a soul, we think of something which is substantially different from a body, meaning the makeup or the composition of the soul is fundamentally different from that of the body it inhabits. We might describe the body as being material, physical, whereas the soul is spiritual, non-physical. Yet this would appear to conflict with the way in which the followers of Heaven's Gate conceptualize the soul, or the mind, or whatever term they happen to be using at any given juncture. How can this apparent contradiction be resolved? If they understand the kingdom of heaven to be a physical place, then the fortunate soul that makes it to the kingdom of heaven after bodily death must itself be a physical entity. In this way, the Heaven's Gate belief system appears to hold what we could call a materialist view of the soul. The soul is just as much a part of the physical universe as the afterlife they hoped it would arrive at. This is obviously very different from what we might consider more conventional understandings of the soul. But then again, maybe it's erroneous to suggest that there is such a thing as a conventional understanding of the soul. And even if there were, conventional is probably not the first word that comes to mind when we think about the Heaven's Gate belief system. What's important to note here is that the implications of this view were not just theoretical. For the followers of Heaven's Gate, this view of the soul had practical implications for the way they lived. They believed that everlasting peace after death could only be secured through consistent effort during life. Much of this effort involved adjusting the way that they related to their own emotions, their own desires, even their own thoughts. And this is precisely where the three-voice concept came into play. In the Transfiguration Diet, the authors identify what they call the three voices. These are the voice of one's environment, the voice of one's genetic heritage, and the voice of the mind. Here, the term voice is being used figuratively. The three voices, as they call them, are more like three sources of values, preferences, what a person is attracted to or avoids, what they hold in high or low regard, what they like or dislike, and, most importantly, why. Underlying this concept is the idea that many of our values, our preferences, our likes and dislikes have their origins outside of ourselves. Some of our preferences may be the result of genetics, particularly what kind of food we like to eat or what kind of food we're able to eat. Some of our values are the result of our environment, the way we were raised, the society we live in. Some of our preferences and values, on the other hand, are acquired through an active process, namely active efforts to change the way we think. We often take for granted that we like certain things and dislike others as though all of our preferences were genuinely ours. We take for granted that we approve of certain actions or ideas and disapprove of others as though all of our values were innate to us. But the authors of the Transfiguration Diet observed that many of the preferences we have, many of the values we hold, are not original to us, but rather are inherited from outside sources. This latter understanding may have been adopted by the followers of Heaven's Gate in order to assist them in making what they took to be positive changes to their attitudes, actions, and emotional responses. Changes which, from their perspective, were absolutely essential for them to make in order to advance beyond the so-called human level and align themselves more closely with the next level. Here's an example. Whenever a thought arose, like a thought, I want to get married and have children, a member of this group might have asked themselves, who is it that wants to get married and have children? Addressing the thought as though it might have been a voice from without, rather than simply accepting it as an authentic desire arising from within, what the individual is asking here is, where does this desire come from? Is it coming from my real self? Or could it be that my society has placed a great deal of value on marriage, on having children? For most people, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It could be the case that someone wants to get married and have children, and it just so happens that they live in a society where such things are valued. But for members of Heaven's Gate, the desire for marriage and children were in conflict with the values of the next level. In the next level, in the afterlife, there are no sexual or romantic partnerships of any kind. There are no children. There is no sexual activity, not for reproduction, not for pleasure. A being which had not overcome their desire for romance or reproduction was still clinging to desires of a human nature, and as such would not be able to enter the next level after death. But overcoming such basic desires is understandably quite difficult, even if someone is able to outwardly renounce such activities as pursuing the gender they're attracted to. The thoughts and feelings associated with sexual and romantic desire were still very likely to arise. For this reason, the members of Heaven's Gate attempted to distance themselves from these thoughts and feelings, to depersonalize them, to attribute them to a source outside of themselves rather than identify with the thoughts. The three-voice concept was just one of the practices they used to accomplish this end. Over time, they thought such practices would lead to having less undesirable thoughts and feelings, as the individual progressively lost their identification with being human and became more closely identified with being a future member of the next level. This is what the followers of Heaven's Gate seem to have in mind with this idea of reprogramming. As we already know, the task of overcoming worldly behaviors and inappropriate patterns of thought was an essential aspect of life in the Heaven's Gate movement. This is what they called the overcoming process. Part of the overcoming process involved reconditioning the way that a person responded to the world around them, moving away from responses they've passively accepted over time or inherited from other people, and moving towards a new set of responses, one that they have actively sought to instill in themselves. They sometimes used the word reprogramming to describe this process. Think about a car radio. If you've ever bought a used car, chances are the previous owner had selected their favorite radio stations in the preset menu. You know, the buttons that you can press so you don't have to bother with the tuning dial. But maybe they had different tastes in music than you do. So now that you're the new owner of this car, you want to be able to quickly find your favorite radio stations. So you go in and reprogram it. You delete the old presets and replace them with the ones you want. In the view of Heaven's Gate believers, someone's personality their preferences, their values, their behaviors. All of this was pre-programmed. But the programming that a person was born with, from their perspective, and developed over time, was not aligned with the values they were striving to integrate into their lives once they began following, or trying to follow, the teachings of Heaven's Gate. So they needed to delete their human programming and replace it with next-level programming. But unlike the presets on a car radio, which are more or less easy to make changes to, human behavior is very difficult to change, which is why so much of the activity in Heaven's Gate centered on strenuous, persistent effort to overcome unwanted personality traits and replace them over time with the traits they aspired to have, the traits they associated with their leaders and with the members of the next level. One way to think about this three-voice concept is to think of it as an attempt to answer a very basic but very difficult question. It's a question that all of us have probably wondered at one time or another, especially after we've done something we didn't want to do or have tried in the past to refrain from doing. We may have asked ourselves, why did I just say that? Or, I swore I'd never do this again. We may have wondered the same thing about other people. Why does he act that way? Why does she always do X, Y, or Z? Ultimately, what we're asking is, what makes someone the way they are? Sometimes, to try and make sense out of the actions and attitudes of others, not to mention ourselves, people will turn to various theories about what makes someone take a particular course of action, why two or more people might respond so differently to the same situation or stimulus. We find answers to this question in a range of fields, including psychology, philosophy, and religion. In any one of these areas, we may find a variety of answers to the question, why do I do what I do? Why do I believe what I believe? Why is it so difficult to change these things, even when I want to? Depending on how we want to frame this basic feature of the human condition, we might label these answers personality theories, causal models, or conceptions of the self. But however we want to frame them, they're all attempting to sketch not just an explanation of human behavior, but hopefully a method for changing our behavior. In this way, the three-voice concept was not merely a theoretical framework for the followers of Heaven's Gate. It also had a specific, practical function in the way these individuals strove to make changes to the way they lived. The way this worked is that followers of Heaven's Gate would try to stop listening to the so-called voice of their environment, their upbringing, their societal conditioning, or the voice of their so-called genetic heritage, their biology, their genetics, and try to start listening more to the voice of the mind. The mind, as the authors make explicit in the Transfiguration Diet, is not identical to the brain. The brain and the mind, they believe, are two different things. Everyone has a brain, but not everyone has a mind given to them by the next level, meaning not everyone has the desire, the drive to even seek out these teachings. But just because someone has a next level mind, as they call it, meaning just because someone has a little flame inside of them that draws them to seek out the teachings of Applewhite and Nettles, doesn't mean that that person is guaranteed to be successful at the overcoming process. So what they tried to do was, over time, identify more and more with the voice of the mind, meaning the voice, the thoughts, the desires that were coming into them from their teachers, from the leaders of the group, from their check partners in some cases, and ultimately from the next level members up in the spaceships watching over them. A good way to understand this distinction between the mind and the brain is to think about a computer. Think about the computer's hardware compared to the software. The brain might have been likened to the hardware of a computer, whereas the ideas that a given mind may hold were likened to the software, like the different programs that might be downloaded onto a computer. The followers of Heaven's Gate believed it was essential to overwrite their old programming, the programming that came from their human biological drives, the programming that came from their human societal values. Using the three voices as a way of conceptualizing and distinguishing between various components of their personality, the followers of Heaven's Gate employed a kind of self-talk, where they addressed the functions and desires of their bodies and brains as though these were somehow separate from themselves. The real self, the self that exists behind the brain, beyond the body, the self that desires change, the self that has the potential to go beyond the human level. That's what they're referring to when they talk about the mind or the soul. The mind is given to a person by the grace of the next level. And it is the responsibility of the individual in Heaven's Gate to cultivate, to nourish, to grow and develop this mind, this gift that they believe they received from this higher level of reality. So while it is clear that the Heaven's Gate theology is dualistic insofar as they carve a sharp distinction between the good values and behaviors of the next level and the evil values and behaviors of the human level, they are monistic insofar as they believe that both of these levels of reality are very much entrenched in the same physical, material universe. Nowhere do they believe it is necessary to step outside of the physical world, even when they began talking about leaving their bodies. They weren't going from a physical existence to a non-physical existence from their point of view. Rather, from their perspective, going from life to life was more like transferring the files from one computer to another. From their perspective, going from the human level to the next level was more like upgrading from an earlier, primitive operating system to a more advanced one. It seems like Heaven's Gate, metaphysically speaking, can have their cake and eat it too. They can have a conception of something like a soul and still retain their otherwise materialist conception of reality. That's something I find pretty interesting. So we've seen how Heaven's Gate believers conceptualize the soul, and how their particular concept of the soul informed some of the practices they undertook while they were alive. We've seen how Heaven's Gate, like many other religions, presents an idea of what happens after death. But as we move into the next and final installment of this short series, I think it's time we talk about how their understanding of the soul, their understanding of what happens after death, related to their decision to bring about their own deaths. Why was it that they believed that in order to transcend the limitations of being human, they would have to terminate their own lives? That's what we'll talk about next time. This concludes episode 5 of In Search of Heaven's Gate. Thanks for listening.